diving into something you've probably heard if you spend any time in the gym. This idea that there's like a strict limit to how much training volume you need for muscle growth.
Right, the junk volume idea.
Exactly. That after a certain point, extra sets are just wasted effort or won't add to your strength or size. But, well, what if that whole conventional wisdom is built on shaky ground?
That's precisely what we're tackling today. This deep dive is all about challenging those myths around training volume for building muscle hypertrophy and for strength gains.
Okay.
We're going to unpack some really key insights from Greg Nuckols' work. More training, more gaining. Everything you need to know about training volume.
So our mission today is to cut through that noise. We want to show you what the best data actually says.
Yeah, and help you understand why some common ideas about the best volume might be, well, leading you astray.
And crucially, we'll also look at how to think more critically about fitness research itself,
Right.
How to understand the science.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's quickly define training volume as we'll use it.
Good idea.
We're talking about weekly fractional sets. So think of it like this. Each set for the main muscle you're targeting counts as one full set.
Okay.
But if a muscle is just helping out a synergist, it counts as half a set.
Got it. And effort matters here too, right?
Hugely important. We're focusing on sets taken right to concentric failure or, very, very close to it. That intensity is key.
Okay. So let's lay out the common viewpoints. You've got the low volume camp.
Right. They often say, 10 or fewer sets a week? Sometimes even down to 5 to 8 for maximum growth.
Then there's the middle ground, probably still the most common view.
Yeah, the 10 to 20 sets per week range. That's kind of the standard advice you often hear.
And finally, the high volume idea, which suggests you actually get the most benefit from more than 20 sets per week. That's what we're really digging into.
Exactly. Let's unpack why that might be the case.
So that conventional wisdom, the stuff drawn from maybe earlier analyses, it painted a confusing picture, didn't it?
It really did. When people first looked at the data comparing volume for muscle growth versus strength, things seemed a bit contradictory.
How so?
Well, for muscle growth, higher volumes generally did seem to lead to more muscle. Although, with diminishing returns, each extra set gave you a bit less bang for your buck.
Okay, that part makes sense. More work, more growth, but tapering off.
But here's the puzzle. For strength, the early data suggested more volume only helped up to about 5 sets per week.
Only 5 sets?
Yeah. Beyond that, the strength benefits seemed to just vanish, or at least become too small to reliably measure.
That sounds like a real head-scratcher. I mean, if you're building more muscle, shouldn't you be getting stronger?
Exactly. That was a conundrum. How could muscle growth keep going up with volume, but strength gains hit a wall so much earlier?
So what was the logic people used to explain that? The low-volume argument?
It led to this very specific rationalist line of thinking. Premise 1. Muscle strength capacity is fully determined by the number of contractile bits, actin, and myosin cross bridges, pulling in parallel.
Okay. More engine parts equals more power. Makes intuitive sense.
Premise 2. They pointed to those findings that higher volumes, beyond 5 sets or so, fail to cause bigger strength gains.
Right.
So the conclusion they drew was, any extra muscle size you see with higher volumes can't be real contractile muscle. It must just be, temporary swelling, or this thing called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, basically, more fluid and non-contractile stuff inside the muscle cell.
So if your strength isn't going up proportionally, that extra size isn't functional. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. But what if the very foundation of that argument, those initial analyses, were flawed? What if it was an apples and oranges comparison?
How so? Where was the mix-up?
This is really the crux of it. The meta-regressions people were citing for hypertrophy and strength outcomes often used mostly different sets of studies.
Ah, okay. Not comparing the same data points.
Exactly. For instance, in one key analysis, only 21 studies overlapped between the 35 hypertrophy studies and the 66 strength studies they looked at.
Wow, that's not much overlap at all.
Right. And it matters because you can't reliably conclude that volume stops helping strengths at 5 sets if the strength data comes from a largely different pool of studies.
Especially if those strength study had issues.
Precisely. Especially if many of those strength studies primarily used untrained lifters.
That seems like a huge confounding factor. Beginners get stronger just by learning the movement, don't they?
Absolutely. So when researchers went back and reanalyzed things, focusing only on studies that met stricter criteria, the picture changed dramatically.
What criteria did they use?
2 main things. First, they only included studies using trained subjects, people who already knew how to lift.
Okay, that filters out those early neural games.
Exactly. Second, they looked for studies that included paired measures, measuring both strength and muscle size changes in the same people, using related metrics, like measuring squat strength and quad muscle thickness.
Makes sense. Comparing the same individuals on relevant measures, and what did that analysis show?
Well, in those more carefully selected studies, higher training volumes were similarly linked to both more muscle growth and larger strength gains.
Okay, so that directly contradicts the idea of strength plateauing at 5 sets.
Completely. When looking within those studies, higher volumes led to more strength in 7 out of 9 comparisons and more muscle in 8 out of 9.
And the exceptions?
Crucially, all 3 instances where higher volume didn't clearly lead to more strength or muscle occurred in studies using untrained lifters.
So that original disconnect really looks like an artifact of mixing trained and untrained populations in different study pools.
It strongly suggests that, yes. But there's another layer, too.
Oh, what's that?
It's about training specificity in the research itself.
How does that play in?
Well, think about how these studies are often designed. Studies testing higher training volumes sometimes end up using protocols with lower specificity for a single 1-rep max strength test.
Why would that be?
If you're doing lower volume, say just 5 sets a week, you might focus purely on heavy squats to maximize your squat 1 RM.
Right, very specific practice.
But if you're doing, say, 25 sets for your quads, you'll likely use a wider variety of exercises, squats, leg presses, extensions, maybe with slightly lighter average loads. Yeah, that's great for overall hypertrophy.
But less specific for that one single lift, the squat 1 RM.
Precisely. So the muscle building benefit of the higher volume can actually counteract the slight negative effect of lower specificity for that single test lift.
So in broader analyses, looking across many studies, it might look like strength gains taper off early with volume.
But it's not necessarily because high volume stops building strength potential. It's partly because the way strength is often measured in high volume studies isn't perfectly aligned with the training done.
That's a really subtle but important point. It's about context.
Definitely. It adds another reason why those initial conclusions were likely off base.
Okay, let's dig even deeper then. Let's go back to that core premise of the low volume argument that strength is fully determined by the contractile bits, the actin and myosin. Is that really the whole story?
It seems increasingly unlikely that it's the whole story. There's fascinating research suggesting other factors play a role.
Like what?
Well, one study found that gains in whole muscle specific force, basically how strong the muscle is for its size, were significantly greater after training than the gains measured in isolated single muscle fibers from that same muscle.
Wait, so the whole muscle got stronger more than its individual parts seemed to?
Exactly. If strength was only about the contractile proteins inside the fibers, those percentages should have been much closer.
So what else could be contributing to that extra whole muscle strength?
The leading hypothesis involves connective tissue adaptations. The idea is that training increases the connections between muscle fibers and the surrounding connective tissue matrix. This enhances something called lateral force transmission.
Lateral force transmission.
Well,
what does that mean in simple terms?
think of it like shifting gears in a car. More connections might act like a lower gear. You get more torque, more force output, even if maybe the potential speed is slightly less. It allows the fibers to work together more effectively to transmit force outwards.
Interesting. Is this a new idea?
Actually, it's kind of an old idea in muscle physiology, but it's really hard to measure directly. We see indirect evidence, though, like changes in specific proteins found at those fiber connective tissue attachment points.
So this provides a real physiological mechanism for how strength gains and muscle size gains could diverge sometimes without resorting to saying the extra muscle isn't real.
Precisely. For example, maybe training very close to failure maximizes muscle protein synthesis, but perhaps slightly different training styles optimize those connective tissue links that boost specific force production. The picture is just more complex.
Okay, that handles the strength disconnect. But what about the other common criticism that the extra size from high volume is just, temporary swelling or non-functional sarcoplasmic hypertrophy?
Right, the illusory gains argument. Let's tackle swelling first.
Muscles definitely swell after a hard workout, right? Due to inflammation and fluid shifts.
They do. And that swelling can peak a few days later. But here's the crucial point. The habituation effect.
Habituation.
Your body adapts incredibly quickly. With repeated exposure to the same type of training stress, the protective adaptations kick in, and muscle damage, soreness, and yes, swelling are drastically reduced.
How quickly does that happen?
Studies show dramatic reductions after just a few sessions. Untrained people might take, say, 8 weeks to fully adapt, but trained lifters adapt much faster.
So for most hypertrophy studies, which usually measure muscle size 48 or 72 hours after the last workout,
In trained lifters, significant, persistent swelling just isn't observed at that point. Recent research confirms this changes between 72 hours and even up to a week post-training are trivial.
what about longer-term studies? Does swelling explain gains over months?
The opposite, actually. The big meta-regressions show a stronger relationship between volume and hypertrophy in longer studies. If swelling was the main driver, you'd expect the effect to fade over time as swelling becomes negligible.
So even if there's a tiny bit of residual swelling in shorter studies, it doesn't explain the overall trend.
Correct. Modeling suggests it might slightly reduce the measured magnitude of volume's effect, but it absolutely does not negate the positive link between volume and actual muscle growth.
Okay, swelling seems unlikely to be the main explanation. What about sarcoplasmic hypertrophy? That idea that the non-contractile fluid and structures increase more than the contractile proteins.
This one's even trickier. First, its very existence is debated, and it's incredibly hard to study reliably.
I've heard it's controversial.
Very. And the strongest indirect evidence that seemed to support it, a 2015 study suggesting bodybuilders had lower force per unit of muscle area, was later refuted.
Refuted? How?
Methodological issues. A follow-up study showed the difference was likely due to differential swelling during the measurement process itself, not an actual difference in contractile protein density.
Wow, okay, so the main piece of evidence kind of crumbled.
Pretty much. Plus, biopsies take such tiny samples that what looks like a change could just be random sampling variance noise in the data.
But if sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is real, is there a plausible role for it?
If it exists, a leading hypothesis is that it's a transient phenomenon that actually facilitates the real myofibrillar growth.
How would that work?
The idea is the muscle cell first synthesizes more ribosomes, the protein-building machinery and metabolic proteins. It ramps up the infrastructure before the massive synthesis of contractile proteins, kind of preparing the factory for expansion.
So if high volume does cause more of it initially, it might actually be a good sign, a predictor of more contractile growth to come.
That's the theory. So we don't have direct evidence that high volume specifically causes more problematic sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and if it does play a role, it might actually be a positive preparatory step.
This discussion really highlights how complex interpreting this research can be, which brings us to a really interesting point you mentioned earlier about different ways of acquiring knowledge.
Right. This is a bit of an epistemological detour, but it's super relevant to understanding why these debates persist. There are basically two main ways we think we know things.
Okay.
Empiricism and rationalism. Empiricism says knowledge comes primarily from data, observation, experiments. What does the evidence show?
Makes sense. See what happens.
Rationalism says knowledge comes primarily from logic, reason, deduction from initial assumptions.
Right.
What must be true based on my understanding of the mechanisms?
Reasoning it out from first principles.
Exactly. Now, science uses both.
Yeah.
Rationalism is great for generating hypotheses based on mechanism X. I predict Y will happen. But empiricism, the data, is what tests those hypotheses. Empirical data is the ultimate arbiter.
So where's the conflict in the volume debate?
The low-volume argument, particularly the one dismissing high-volume hypertrophy because strength didn't track perfectly, is fundamentally a rationalist argument. It prioritized a logical deduction, if strength doesn't increase, the muscle isn't real, over the direct empirical data showing muscle was growing.
Why is prioritizing empiricism generally better in science, especially in a complex field like exercise physiology?
Several reasons. First, it allows you to scale your confidence with the strength of the evidence. Weak evidence, low confidence; strong evidence, high confidence. Rationalism often leads to absolute certainty based on logic, which can collapse painfully if a premise is wrong.
Okay, more flexible.
Second, it makes updating beliefs easier. New data comes in, you gradually shift your view, you don't have to throw out your entire logical framework.
False upheaval.
And third, it's less hindered by incomplete mechanistic understanding. Think about drug trials. Like you said, over 99% of drugs with a sound mechanistic rationale fail in human trials because the real-world data doesn't match the logical prediction. Our understanding of hypertrophy mechanisms is still incomplete.
So we can't just rely on it makes sense logically.
Exactly. But rationalism is alluring, isn't it? It feels natural. It's often easier and quicker to construct a logical story. It makes for compelling viral content because it's sounds definitive.
Yeah, people like certainty.
And it allows creators to project confidence. But, and this is critical, it's also the language of pseudoscience. It's easy to use plausible-sounding rationalist arguments, studies are too short, it's just swelling, correlation isn't causation, to cast doubt on direct empirical evidence, even when it's strong.
Like the BCAA example you mentioned, logically they should work.
But the direct evidence overwhelmingly shows they don't build muscle on their own. So for you, the listener, the goal is to recognize how experts should model inquiry. Scale claims with evidence, embrace uncertainty, test hypotheses with data. Don't get swept away by a good story if the data doesn't back it up.
That's a really powerful framework. Okay, let's pivot back to the practical takeaways. First big question, is that 10-20 sets per week range really the evidence-based consensus for muscle growth?
No, not anymore. And arguably, it never truly was based on strong evidence against higher volumes. For a very long time, like 18 years, there was only one study directly comparing moderate versus higher volume for hypertrophy, and it showed similar triceps gains for 10 versus 20 sets.
Just one study?
For a long time, yeah.
Yeah.
Then, as more studies came out in the mid-2010s, a clearer positive trend for volumes above 20 sets started to emerge.
But didn't some studies seem to contradict that? I remember hearing about studies showing diminishing returns or even worse results with very high volumes.
Ah, yes. This is where the Barbaleo effect comes in. It's crucial history. Two studies published in 2019 provided strong support for the low to moderate volume argument. They were widely cited and became a cornerstone for that viewpoint.
Okay.
But both of those studies were later retracted due to data fabrication.
Fabricated data? Seriously?
Seriously. Once those influential but fraudulent studies were removed from the evidence base, the picture became much clearer and leaned heavily towards higher volumes being more effective on average.
Wow. So what does the current evidence post-retraction say about that 20-plus set range?
If you look at the recent high-volume studies, about 19 direct comparisons available now, the average hypertrophy effect for 20-plus sets per week was roughly double that seen for 19 sets per week.
Double? That's substantial.
It is, and 16 out of those 19 comparisons favored the higher volume group. So the current evidence strongly supports volumes exceeding 20 sets per week for maximizing hypertrophy, on average.
Okay, so if more is generally better, average-wise, where's a conservative limit based on solid data? And what's the potential actual upper limit?
Conservatively, looking at where the data density is still pretty good, around 25 sets per muscle group per week seems like a reasonable upper end for high-confidence recommendations. The authors of the big Pellin meta-regression advise caution interpreting beyond that point, just due to fewer studies.
And the actual limit, where does it top out?
We honestly don't know. The highest volume rigorously tested in research is 45 sets per week for a muscle group.
45.
45. And even at that level, studies still showed greater hypertrophy compared to lower volumes. That classic inverted U curve, where adding more volume eventually makes things worse due to overtraining. Well, we haven't actually found the top of that curve for a hypertrophy yet in the research literature.
That's pretty mind-blowing for a lot of lifters, but it immediately brings up the practical question. Is it even feasible to do, say, 30-plus sets per week for every single body part? Does an overall recovery become an issue?
That's a very fair and common concern. Time in the gym, systemic fatigue. It seems like a lot.
Right.
But interestingly, when you look at survey data from competitive bodybuilders, doing 30-40 sets per week for major muscle groups isn't that unusual for them.
Okay, so the elite might do it. What about research?
Studies that have trained multiple muscle groups simultaneously with high volumes generally show similar positive results to single muscle studies. There isn't a clear pattern in the research confirming this idea that you'll hit a hard global recovery wall that prevents high volume across the board.
So maybe that general gym wisdom about hitting a global limit is influenced by other factors.
It could be. Part of it might be exercise selection. 40 sets of heavy deadlifts and overhead presses per week is vastly different systemically than 40 sets of bicep curls and leg extensions.
A good point. Compound versus isolation.
And also adaptation. The first few weeks of significantly increasing volume are tough. You'll likely be sore and fatigued, but the body adapts quite quickly. Usually within 2-3 weeks, soreness decreases, fatigue lessens.
The gradual increases are key.
Gradual ramping helps mitigate that initial shock. So while we don't have studies where subjects did, say, 30 sets for every single major muscle group simultaneously, the current evidence suggests you can likely benefit from training most muscle groups with quite high volumes, provided you manage exercise selection, joint health, and ramp up intelligently.
This leads directly to a crucial point in this whole debate. Does everyone actually grow more with high training volumes? We hear so many anecdotes about individual differences.
Absolutely key. And the research, though still a bit limited on this specific question, does show increased variability in hypertrophy responses at higher volumes compared to lower volumes.
Meaning the average might be higher, but the spread of results is wider.
Exactly. There was a great within-subject study where people trained one leg with 6 sets per week for quads and the other leg with 18 sets.
Okay, comparing high versus low in the same person, what happened?
Out of 34 participants, about 13 grew significantly more with the higher volume leg, but 3 actually grew more with the lower volume leg, and for 18 people, there was no meaningful difference between the 2 legs.
Wow, so a real mix. About a third really benefited, but most didn't see a huge difference or even did better with less.
Right, and the ones who responded best to high volume also showed greater increases in markers related to ribosome biogenesis, basically, building more protein-making machinery.
Any other evidence for this variability?
Another study looked at responses to a high-volume program, 27 sets week, and found a clear spread. High responders, moderate responders, and even low or non-responders. These differences were linked to individual variations in satellite cell activity and anabolic growth factor responses.
So what could cause this? Genetics? Fiber type?
Those are plausible speculations. Maybe people with a higher proportion of type I, slow-twitch fibers, benefit more from the fatigue generated by higher volumes. Genetics certainly plays a role in overall responsiveness to training.
So the bottom line here is that 2 things can be true at once.
Precisely. The research is accurate. Higher volume generally leads to more growth on average. And it's also true that higher volumes simply don't work better for everyone. Individual response is significant.
Okay, that perfectly sets up the next question someone might ask. I tried higher volume and it didn't work for me. Why not? Besides just being a potential low responder, what else could be going on?
Probably the most common reason, honestly, is an unintentional decrease in per set effort.
The intensity drops off.
Exactly. The research studies we're discussing rely on very high effort failure, or just shy of it, on basically every single set counted. Researchers are often, yelling encouragement. There might be incentives, strict monitoring.
Stuff that doesn't happen in a typical gym session.
Right. In the real world, maintaining that maximal intensity across, say, 25 sets for a muscle group in a week is incredibly demanding. If your attempt at higher volume actually meant doing more sets, but many of them were lower effort, maybe stopping further from failure.
Then you wouldn't get the results seen in the studies where effort was maximal. That's the real junk volume.
That's arguably the most practical definition of junk volume sets performed with insufficient effort to stimulate growth, often because fatigue is set in from trying to do too much volume with high effort.
Makes sense. So if high volume can work for many, and the limit might be quite high, why don't we see lots of average gym goers doing 40-plus sets per muscle group regularly?
Several practical reasons. First, and maybe foremost, time commitment.
Yeah, that's a lot of time in the gym.
It really is. Even if 40 sets gives you, say, 20% more muscle growth than 20 sets over a year, that might require 50% or even 100% more time spent training. For many people with jobs, families, other hobbies, that trade-off just isn't worth it, especially when you factor in potential increased injury risk from sheer exposure.
The law of diminishing returns hitting practical limits.
Exactly. Second, training age and chronological age might play a role. Optimal volume might decrease as you become very highly trained, or as you get older. You might hit bottlenecks related to connective tissue recovery or maybe bioenergetic capacity that limit tolerance for extreme volumes.
So the peak might shift over a lifting career.
It's plausible. And third, let's be honest, the data at those really high volumes, 40 plus, is still pretty sparse. It's possible that for most people, 40 sets doesn't actually yield significantly more growth than, say, 25 or 30 sets. We just don't have enough data to know for sure where the curve truly flattens for most individuals.
Okay, another extrapolation question. These studies are typically, 8-12 weeks long? How far can we confidently project these results into the future? If high volume shows 5% more growth in 3 months, does that mean 20% more in a year?
No, we definitely cannot assume linear extrapolation like that.
Why not?
Because long-term adaptations follow logarithmic curves, not straight lines. You make faster progress initially, and then the rate of gain slows down over months and years. If you gain 5% muscle every 2-3 months consistently, you'd be unbelievably muscular in just a few years, which obviously doesn't happen.
Right, diminishing returns over time as well.
Exactly. So what can we say? We could be reasonably confident that higher volumes likely lead to more growth over, say, the first 1-2 years of consistent training. The fact that longer studies tend to show larger advantages for higher volume supports this.
But beyond that, like 5 or 10 years down the line?
It gets much fuzzier. It's plausible that over a very long lifting career, someone training with moderate volume, maybe 15, 20 sets, and someone training with consistently high volume, 25 plus sets, might end up in a similar place, assuming effort is high in both cases. However, very low volumes, like less than 10 sets, are unlikely to maximize long-term potential.
What about volume cycling? This idea of intentionally varying your volume in waves, maybe ramping up and then backing off.
It's a popular concept, based on the idea of providing a novel stimulus and managing fatigue. There's some indirect support for periodization in general, but also some skepticism about whether specific complex cycling models are superior to just consistent training.
So no definitive proof it's better.
Not really strong, direct proof that cycling volume itself is the magic bullet. But here's an important caveat. Even in studies looking at periodization or cycling, the groups that had a higher average weekly volume over the course of the study generally still gained more muscle and strength, regardless of whether they cycled or not.
So total volume still seems to be a primary driver, even if cycling has some benefits.
That seems to be the case based on current evidence. Average volume matters.
Okay, let's get back to the why. Why or how do higher volumes potentially lead to more growth? What are the speculative mechanisms?
The simplest answer is just more volume equals a larger total stimulus for adaptation. More work, more reason for the muscle to grow.
Fair enough. But any more specific ideas?
One compelling speculation relates back to engaging more muscle fibers, especially the less fatigable type I slow twitch fibers, and those associated with lower threshold motor units.
How would higher volume help there?
As you perform more sets and fatigue builds up, your body has to recruit more and more motor units, including those lower threshold ones, and work them harder to continue producing force. Higher volumes might ensure that even these more endurance-oriented fibers receive a robust enough stimulus to grow, long after the higher threshold easily fatigued fibers have done their work.
Interesting. Does this predict anything about who responds best?
Well, this model might predict that people with more type I fibers could benefit more from higher volumes. Anecdotally, some coaches observe that explosive lifters, who likely have more type 2 fast twitch fibers, often seem to thrive on lower volumes, while less explosive, more grinder-type lifters seem to do better with higher volumes. It aligns, but it's speculative.
Okay, that's one idea. Any others?
Another angle involves bioenergetic adaptations. As muscles get bigger, their surface area to volume ratio changes, which can actually make them a bit less metabolically efficient in some ways.
How does volume fit in?
Higher volume training, especially if it involves significant metabolic stress, might strongly stimulate adaptations that support metabolism and nutrient delivery. Things like increased capillary density, more blood vessels to deliver oxygen and fuel, and remove waste. These capillaries are often located near satellite cells, potentially influencing their function too.
Okay, better plumbing.
And possibly improved mitochondrial functioning, better energy production within the muscle cells. These kinds of metabolic fitness improvements within the muscle might facilitate faster or greater long-term hypertrophy by supporting the energy demands of growth and recovery.
So it's not just about the direct stimulus to contractile protein, but also improving the muscle support systems.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
It even challenges some older ideas like the interference effect, where people thought endurance-type work always hindered muscle growth. We now see that combining stimuli can sometimes lead to more hypertrophic signaling, perhaps via these metabolic pathways.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, let's circle back to strength. You made it clear earlier that the apparent divergence between strength and hypertrophy in research is often due to study design. Does this mean you actually do believe strength and hypertrophy are closely related for individuals?
Yes, absolutely. Let me be clear. I and the author Greg Nuckols, whose work we're discussing, firmly believe they are related, especially for serious trained lifters over the long term.
So the research confusion is just confusion.
It stems from the context of most research. Short durations, 8 to 12 weeks, often using untrained subjects who get huge neural gains, and sometimes unfamiliar exercises where people are just learning the movement. In that specific context, early strength gains are dominated by learning and neural efficiency, completely swamping the contribution from actual muscle growth.
So you can't use short-term strength changes in beginners as a proxy for hypertrophy in those studies.
Exactly. Trying to do so leads to absurd conclusions, like suggesting that doing 5 sets but stopping 10 reps shy of failure is somehow optimal for muscle growth. just because it might maximize strength gains in a very short-term specific scenario.
But for an individual tracking their own progress, when can strength be a good indicator of muscle growth?
It becomes a much better indicator under specific conditions. When you're a trained lifter, looking over the long term, like a year or more, using consistent lifts you're skilled at, and employing relatively similar training methods over that time.
So consistency and time are key for that relationship to show up reliably.
Precisely. Simulations show that even if there's a perfect true correlation between underlying strength potential and muscle size, small measurement errors common in studies can completely obscure that relationship in short-term 8-12-week research. But over longer periods, the signal comes through the noise.
So the takeaway is, don't use short-term strength data from research studies to make definitive conclusions about hypertrophy, but do pay attention to your own long-term strength progress on key lifts as a useful, albeit imperfect, sign that you're likely gaining muscle.
That's a perfect summary of the nuance.
Okay, shifting slightly, we've focused on weekly volume. What about per workout volume? How many sets should someone aim for in a single session?
Yeah, the main driver seems to be total weekly volume. How you split that up into individual workouts depends largely on your preferred training frequency.
So if I train a muscle group once a week versus 3 times a week, the per session volume would be different.
Exactly. If your target is, say, 20 weekly sets, that's 20 sets in one session if you train it once a week, or maybe 6-7 sets per session if you train it 3 times a week.
Is there any evidence for an optimal per session volume or a limit?
There's one meta-regression that looked specifically at per session volume for strength gains. It suggested a point of, let's call it uncomfortable skepticism, around 11 fractional sets per workout, meaning the confidence that more sets in that single session would lead to better strength gains started to decrease around that point.
So maybe around 10-12 sets per muscle group in one workout is a reasonable upper guideline for strength, but hypertrophy might be different.
Possibly. And again, weekly volume seems more critical for hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Practically, if you're aiming for those higher weekly volumes we discussed, like 20-30 sets, you'll likely need to train muscle groups at least twice, maybe 3 or more times per week, to keep the per session volume manageable and potentially more effective. 5 sets per session 5 times a week gets you 25 weekly sets.
That makes sense. Let's tackle junk volume and diminishing returns head on. These terms are thrown around a lot to argue against higher volumes. Are diminishing returns real?
Oh, absolutely. Diminishing returns are definitely real with training volume. Each additional set you add provides less marginal benefit than the previous one.
So the first 5 sets might give you X amount of growth, the next 5 give you less than X, the next 5 even less.
Exactly. Maybe doubling your muscle growth requires tripling your training volume. Just as an example, it's not a linear relationship.
So this creates a trade-off.
A huge one. It's about efficiency versus maximization. If your main goal is efficiency, getting pretty good results with minimal time investment, then focusing on those first high-return sets, lower volume, makes perfect sense.
But if your goal is to maximize your absolute potential,
then you probably need to push into those zones of diminishing returns. Higher volumes are likely necessary, even if each extra set gives you only a small additional benefit. Focusing purely on efficiency might mean leaving, potentially, half of your long-term potential gains on the table.
So junk volume isn't necessarily volume that does nothing.
It depends how you define junk. It just means additional volume with significantly diminished returns. Then whether it's junk is a personal value judgment based on your goals and time availability. If it means additional volume yielding absolutely no further returns, well, as we discussed, the true limit where that happens seems to be very high, likely well beyond what most people do, maybe over 50-60 sets a week, if it exists at all, within practical ranges.
So what's the real junk volume then, in a practical sense?
Like we touched on earlier, the real junk volume is probably when your per set effort decreases significantly because you're trying to do too much. If adding more sets means you start half-assing them, stopping way short of failure, losing focus, that volume isn't likely contributing much, regardless of whether it's your 10th set or your 30th set. Effort is paramount.
That clarifies things a lot. Okay, after this incredibly detailed journey, let's bring it home. How much volume do you actually recommend? What's the actionable advice for a listener trying to figure this out?
For many people, the reality is that life constraints, time, energy, recovery capacity will dictate volume more than anything else. In that case, the focus should be on efficiently using the time you do have, making every set count with high effort.
But what if someone feels they've plateaued with their current volume, and they do have the capacity to do more? How should they explore higher volumes?
If you suspect you might benefit from more, my top recommendation is a gradual ramp up. Don't jump from 10 sets to 30 overnight.
Okay, how gradual?
Maybe increase your weekly volume for muscle group by about 20%. Add 2-3 sets if you're doing 10-15, and stick with that for 2-4 weeks. See how you feel, monitor your performance and recovery. If it feels good and performance is stable or improving, add another 20%.
So you let your body adapt along the way.
Exactly. This approach lets you adapt physiologically and psychologically, and it gives you clear feedback on whether the higher volume is actually working for you without just shocking the system.
Are there other ways to experiment?
Progressive volume cycling, like we mentioned, is a valid strategy some people use, though maybe more complex to manage. Another approach I really like for self-experimentation is using body part specialization blocks.
How does that work?
You pick just 1-3 muscle groups you really want to grow, and you hit those with significantly higher volume, maybe 20, 25, even 30 sets per week for a specific block of time, like 2-3 months, while maybe maintaining or slightly reducing volume for other body parts.
Why is that helpful?
It gives you a really clear signal about your individual responsiveness to high volume for those specific muscles. It's easier to maintain high per set effort when you're only pushing the volume hard on a few things. If you see great results, you know high volume works well for you, at least for those muscles, and you can then think about how to integrate higher baseline volumes more broadly over time.
That sounds like a very practical way to test the waters. Any final key considerations?
Remember that individual variability is huge. Research shows averages, but your mileage may vary significantly. Like we said, maybe only about a quarter of people get dramatically better results with high volume, while others see modest benefits, no difference, or even do slightly better with lower volumes.
So don't feel pressured to do high volume if it doesn't seem to work for you after careful experimentation.
Absolutely. The ultimate goal isn't just to hit some arbitrary high volume number. It's to find the volume that allows you to achieve the results you want, sustainably.
What about starting points? General guidelines.
If you're looking for solid muscle growth with minimal time, starting around 10 sets per week per muscle group done with high effort is likely very effective. If your goal is to truly maximize hypertrophy and you have the time and recovery capacity, aiming for somewhere in the 15-25 sets per week range seems like a good starting point based on current evidence, with the understanding that you might benefit from even more, requiring that self-experimentation.
And one crucial reminder.
Do not try to significantly increase your training volume while you're actively trying to lose weight in a calorie deficit. That's generally a recipe for poor recovery and potentially losing muscle. Save those big volume pushes for periods when you're eating at maintenance or in a slight surplus.
Fantastic. This has been an incredibly thorough deep dive. We've gone from challenging core assumptions about strength and size to the physiology, the research interpretation, and finally, practical application.
The hope is that this encourages listeners to be more discerning consumers of fitness information, to really prioritize the direct evidence over narratives that just sound logical but might lack support, and to embrace self-experimentation.
Finding what truly works for you.
Exactly. Rather than blindly following rigid rules or, conversely, dismissing research just because it challenges beliefs you've held for a long time.
Which leads perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. If what the direct research evidence shows challenges your long-held beliefs about training, is it necessarily the research that's flawed, or could it be time to reconsider the framework you use to approach knowledge and update your understanding?